Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. In today's program, A Better Life for Their Children. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. One second. I'm so sorry. There we go. Sorry, I was not the host. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Andrew Feiler's exhibition. It will be on display at the center from May 22nd, which is tomorrow, through mid-December, December 12th. Okay. So please check it out when you have a chance. I just want to give a disclaimer that all comments from the moderators and the panelists are their own individual comments, and they do not reflect the center's official position. And I want to introduce our moderator, Dr. James Calleroz White. He's the head of school at the Galloway School and has over 22 years of experience in independent schools across the country. He currently serves on the board for NAIS, Horizons Atlanta, and ISACS, and is an NAIS Diversity Leadership Institute faculty member. He holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Education from Harvard University and a Doctor of Education from Arizona State University. Thank you for being with us today, James, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to the panel today. I am super excited to actually be able to introduce our panelists and really get this show started, because the topic and the interest around this work is phenomenal. So with that, I'd like to introduce Andrew Feiler as the author of the book. He is a fifth-generation Georgian. He has helped create over a dozen community initiatives, serves on multiple nonprofit boards, and is an active advisor to numerous elected officials and political candidates. His newest book, which is what we're here to talk about, is called A Better Life for Their Children. Julius, Rosenwald, Dr. Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 schools that changed America. He'll tell us a little bit about that title here in a second. And we are just really honored to have him with us here today to discuss and to bring this work to life. One of our other panelists today that we have with us is Janeen Bryant. She is the Director of Operations at the Center for Racial Equity and Education. She is a classroom educator turned advocate. Mrs. Bryant is known widely as a facilitator and community-centered program developer, both regionally and nationally. In 2015, as the Regional Director South for Leadership for Educational Equity, she directly engaged with teachers, parents, and community leaders to use their voice directly, influencing decision makers and ultimately changing the reality of their education system. I'm also honored to have Raymond Pierce, who is the president and CEO of Southern Education Foundation. Raymond serves as the president and CEO of the Southern Education Foundation, where he leads the organization's historic mission of advancing educational opportunities for African American and low-income students in the Southern states. Since joining SEF in January of 2018, he has focused the organization on policy research, education legislation, and leadership development. SEF has also launched a workforce development initiative and is expanding its efforts for strengthening parental engagement in support of improving student learning. It is Pierce, sorry, Mr. Raymond Pierce, I said Price, my apologies. And the fact of the matter is that all three of these folks here today are experts in what they do. And so being able to hear from them about this important topic is something that I am looking forward to. Mr. Feiler, I am going to turn the mic over to you.
Great, thank you. It is great to be here, and let me just say that it's an extraordinary honor to have this work come to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. I have been involved in this project from the very beginning. I was one of the folks who teamed with Shirley Franklin to help raise the funds to bring the King Papers to Atlanta. and was involved in a lot of the early discussions that led to the creation of the center through Doug Shipman's leadership. So it's a special thrill and honor to be part of this program. Let me share my screen and I will talk a little bit about this project. There we go. So let me just add one more thing. This book came out 6 weeks ago. The reaction has been extraordinary. There's been a double-page spread in the Wall Street Journal. It was in Smithsonian Magazine, and Architect Magazine, Preservation Magazine. The book's already in its third printing, and yet I walked into the center yesterday for press previews, and the exhibition is just exquisite. So I don't want to get too far into this without simply saying that Jill Savitt, Kalinda Lee, and her team have just been beautiful to work with, and the exhibition is exquisitely done, and I'm most appreciative of that. The Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically transforms this country. It profoundly reshapes the African-American experience, and yet its scope and sweep are largely unknown and remain hidden history. This is a photograph of a photograph. I'm going to show you, these are photographs that I've taken that are in this book. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County in North Georgia. Julius Rosenwald, born to Jewish immigrants who fled religious persecution in Germany. It grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home when Lincoln is resident in Springfield. And he rises to become the president of Sears Roebuck and Company, and he leads the company from 1908 until his death in 1932, and he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what later becomes known as civil rights. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, of course, becomes one of the most prominent African-American voices of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and is the founding principal of the historically Black college known as Tuskegee. The two men meet in 1911. This is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers and their descendants were invited to sign the quilt. And today it hangs in the restored schoolhouse. Now, 1911, and I want to specifically, it was May 18th, 1911. Which means this week is the 110th anniversary of their meeting. And in 1911, we have to remember, this is before the Great Migration. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. And public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so in 1912, they create this program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. And they reach out to the Black communities of the South. And they say, we want you to be a full partner in your progress. And if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution, cash, land, and labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because one, we want to deliberately establish more Black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress. And because these have to be public schools. So the white school system has to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. If you do that, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. And from 1912, when the community of Lochapoka in Lee County, Alabama, begins to raise the funds that become the first Rosenwald School, until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of what is the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. And the result of this program is transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald Schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a persistent Black-white education gap in the South, and that gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II, and that the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald Schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrate Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald Schools. And Congressman Lewis, in one of his last public acts, wrote this glorious introduction to my book in which he describes his very first day in an Alabama Rosenwald School and the role that education has played in his life. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald Schools, and in February of 2015, I found myself at lunch with Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African-American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office, and the story shocked me. I'm a fifth-generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life: Jewish, Southern, progressive activist. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald Schools? So I come home that day and I Google Rosenwald School, and I find out that there are a few books on this subject, but there is not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. Of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 remain. Only about half of those have been restored. In over 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles to all 15 program states and shot 105 of the surviving schools. So this is the Emory School, likely the oldest surviving Rosenwald School from around 1915, and it's in Hale County, Alabama. This is what's known as a white one-teacher school. There are also 2 teacher schools. This is the Noble Hill School in North Georgia. 3 teacher schools. Now notice those are all small white clapboard structures, 1, 2, and 3 teacher schools. And by the time you get to the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Little Rock, Arkansas. It is today a magnet middle school, but it's one of the very few schools, Rosenwald Schools, still in use for educational purposes, because most outgrew that use long ago. They were simply too small. So in the quest to preserve this history and preserve this memory, these schools have had to have been adaptively reused. And so you see, I start with this architectural narrative, and then I go inside these schools. These are the Pleasant Hill quilters who sold quilts to raise money to restore the Pleasant Hill School in Cass County, Texas, and today meet on most Mondays inside the school to quilt. Some have been adapted into church halls. Others are museums. This is the Warfield School in Tennessee, which has been turned into this community center and part museum that's really exquisitely done. But many remain unrestored and at risk of collapse. And there is embedded into this story this plea for preservation, because these schools represent history and memory and story and an essential part of our cultural narrative that we need to save and honor. Now, but the emotional heart of this story was the people that I met. I'm going to show you 2 portraits, one of former students and one of a former teacher. These are brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. They stand in the Calleroz School in Sumner County, Tennessee, under the watchful gaze of a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that has hung in this school since it opened in 1923. Both Frank and Charles are brothers. They both went to the school. They both went to graduate school. They both became educators. And they have 4 sisters, all of whom also went to the school, all of whom went to college. Those 6 siblings have 10 children, and all 10 children went to college. And that legacy is simply one that may never have happened were it not for this school. This is the Bay Springs School in Mississippi, outside of Hattiesburg in Kelly Settlement, Mississippi. I'm going to take you into the school, and this is Ellie Damer. So Ellie Damer is the widow of Vernon Damer. Vernon Damer's grandfather donated the land for the Bay Springs School, and he built into that deed a reversionary clause. And so when the school closed in 1958, it reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned this school into a locus of civil rights activity. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here, And when Vernon Dahmer would drive people into Hattiesburg to try to register them to vote, he would have them park behind the school so that they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. And on the night of, but this drew the attention and ire of the Ku Klux Klan. And on the night of January 10th, 1966, Vernon Dahmer's home was firebombed and attacked by the Klan. And he stood in the front window with a gun holding off the attackers so that his wife, Ellie, could get their children out the back door. He's badly burned in the fire, the resulting fire, and dies from his injuries. Vernon Dahmer attended the Bay Springs School. This is his widow, Ellie Dahmer, who attended a different Rosenwald school and after college taught at the Bay Springs School until it closed in 1958. And now her son has recently restored it back to its role as a community center, the role that it played in the civil rights movement. But I want to use this image to tell one more story, which relates to our conversation specifically today. Teachers played a very much unheralded role in the civil rights movement. Number one, they taught democracy and equality. And that helped set the expectations that are bedrock to the civil rights movement. But in addition, we think about the litigation of Brown v. Board that makes the case that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And Thurgood Marshall and his team are the face of that fight. But they based their argument on data, and that data came through teachers' associations, like the one that Raymond Pierce represents today and is going to talk about today. And Ellie Dahmer was one of those teachers. We sat in the school for 2 hours talking before I did this portrait of her. And she talked about her role in helping gather that data through these teachers association and sending it up to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that used that data to help craft their argument. And it's stories like these that caused me to turn this body of work into a hybrid body of work. There's 85 photographs in this book. Each photograph, or in some cases pairs of photographs, comes with a story, because I found Rosenwald Schools that are directly connected to the Trail of Tears, the Great Migration, the Tuskegee syphilis study. And so I hope that folks will spend time with these images, but I hope they'll also spend time with these stories. And each of the stories are part of the exhibition, because I think you'll find these stories inspiring, moving, and give you a little more optimism about the possibility of change in America. I'm going to close on some comments related to the title of this book, A Better Life for Their Children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. And the parents and the African-American communities that were already being taxed to pay for white schools that had to dig deeper to help make these schools possible were looking for better lives for their children. And collectively, they came together and they transformed this country. And I think the central narrative of this work speaks to everybody who is walking in the streets today for social justice, that we can come together and we can change the world. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Feiler. This it's an incredible collection, and for those who have not had an opportunity to get the book, I was lucky enough to get one of the first runs, I believe, and it is a magnificent kind of history lesson in many ways, but also I so appreciate this idea of the hopefulness also that I felt after reading it. So just again, many thanks for this project.
Thank you.
I wanted to jump right in with the panelists here. And so I want to start with a piece that says there's a passage in the book that reads, "The Rosenwald School program was innovative and sophisticated. It was rooted in Washington and Rosenwald's belief that success required the local Black community to be a full partner in its school." Given your respective roles, what do you believe this means for schools that are currently serving majority Black and Brown students in this country? And Raymond, I'll give it to you first. How about that? Since I didn't ask which one.
Okay. So the question is, please repeat the question, James.
Sure. So the question just simply is, given your respective roles in terms of the work that you're doing right now, what do you believe this idea of local communities contributing to the kind of the success of schools, in particular as it pertains to communities of color and schools that are serving predominantly Black and brown students?
Well, thank you, James. And Dr. Feiler, Andrew, wonderful story, wonderful presentation. And I speak about Rosenwald maybe 3 or 4 times a month in my work. And I couple Julius Rosenwald with people like George Peabody, who actually put up the first $1 million after the Civil War to create the Peabody Fund. James Slater spent over $3 million. All of them, this was a massive effort right after the Civil War. The federal government was not doing as much as philanthropists like Julius Rosenwald and others were understood over time. Anna T. Jeans, one of the wealthiest women in the nation at the time, a Quaker woman out of Philadelphia, created the Jeans Teachers. Just like Julius Rosenwald is credited for creating all these schools, Anna T. Jeans, without question, had probably one of the largest impact on African-American education in this nation's history. She created that army of teachers known as the Jeans Teachers and the Jeans Supervisors that populated the schools that Rosenwald was building. And then the Jeans Supervisors that supervise. Keep in mind, there was no public education in the South following the Civil War. This was a combination of work between Black folks freed from slavery and philanthropists like Julius Rosenwald and others that I mentioned. So to answer that question, I'd like to put that context I just gave, I think helps. Let's understand something. In the history of the education of African Americans in this nation, Black folks were always, always were trying to get an education. Even during the days of enslavement, we're trying to get we're getting themselves educated, often at great risk, having a hand cut off or being beaten or whatever, maybe killed. But we were always getting our hands on a piece of paper or some document and getting behind a barn and trying to figure out those characters and what they meant, understanding that separated, somehow had some distinction between us being enslaved and not. And of course, there were those whites who, for whatever reason, the goodness of their heart, sought to educate those who were enslaved, often the people who they were enslaved. But, it was against the law. So, but when the war ended, a phenomenon created very quickly, I mean, probably before the last guns went off, and that is the creation of the field schools. And these were schools created by Black folks, for Black folks out in the fields, to quickly learn to read, write, and add, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And when folks like Julius Rosenwald and I have to give shout outs to the Peabodys and the Slaters and the Jeans, because they're the ones that's the only fund that was not consolidated to form what is now the Southern Education Foundation was the Rosenwald Fund. The Peabody Fund, the Slater Fund, the Jeans Fund, and the Randolph Fund were all eventually consolidated into 1934 to form what is now the Southern Education Foundation. But Julius Rosenwald and Rockefeller too, the Rockefeller, the General Education Board. This was a major political movement led by philanthropy for the most part, white philanthropy, coupled with Black folks and their political will to educate themselves through the field schools, to build schools, train teachers, and buy books, and get Black folks educated. It was a major piece. I mean, there's no, and I'm going to answer the question. It's no small wonder that we've had 6 former U.S. presidents serve on the board. Why? And including Eleanor Roosevelt, plus Eleanor Roosevelt. Why? Because this was a major piece. And what it showed, to answer your question, is the empowerment of communities. Today, we call that community schools. Communities, because what Julius Rosenwald did, and I have original letters from Booker T. Washington in our archives, and how he was helping manage these funds, the Rosenwald funds, and a lot of this, and the Jeans Fund. He was a big contributor. I mean, benefited greatly from Anna T. Jeans. I suspect Anna T. Jeans introduced Booker T. Washington to Julius Rosenwald when Julius Rosenwald was trying to find out how he can get involved. But I was looking at some of Booker T. Washington's letters and that are in our archives, and it's amazing. In addition to running Tuskegee University, he was communicating by letter with communities in Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, funding for people who are applying to get money for these schools, it was all community. It was all community. This was not a national effort. This was not a state effort. This was communities coming together, attaching themselves to this philanthropic movement that had some organization with Booker T. Washington, largely involved, to secure those funds, to build these schools, to place these teachers, bring in the books, and this massive movement that Andrew talked about earlier was underway. So I have to say this, when we talk about in the civil rights community, and I'm a former civil rights attorney out of Little Rock, Arkansas. I worked for John Walker. I worked on Little Rock school desegregation case. It was still in court in the 1980s when I was right out of law school. I think sometimes we have to be very careful about the criticism on neighborhood schools. Because neighborhood schools at one time were community schools. At one time would have been Rosenwald schools. Mm-hmm. It was empowering communities. But we understand those in those civil rights laws that neighborhood schools oftentimes were synonymous with what? Segregated schools. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be very careful when not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right. I've oftentimes argued that schools are resources for communities. And so when we talk about desegregation, let's not do it in a way that is disempowering of Black communities, because these Rosenwald schools empowered Black communities. They empowered Black communities, which is why today the Southern Education Foundation is a large supporter, as others, of community schools. So that's a roundabout way of saying that the Rosenwald schools and that big effort that was going on in the days following Reconstruction, even afterwards. Yes, the primary focus was the education of African Americans, but they were community builders. They helped build African American communities.
Right. And so as we roll into this next part of this question for you, Janeen, given that historical context and so forth, it is clear that the African American community in these particular schools had a vested interest, if you will. Given the structures that are in place today, in particular around school and school funding and so forth, where does the African American community, where is that entry point now in terms of helping some of these quote unquote community schools or neighborhood schools? And how do you feel, Janeen, from that perspective in terms of what you believe that some of these communities and schools can do to have the same kind of impact and empowerment as some of these schools that have come before them?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you. And thank you, Andrew Feiler, for the work that you've done. I think there's a tremendous through line for this historic narrative that we're setting, this context that we're setting all the way through to today, like right this moment. Because education in Black communities has always been an act of resistance. So the idea of having field schools, the idea of having Rosenwald schools, the idea of the will of the Black community to educate and empower their children has always been there. And I think there's sort of like a consciousness of that in the Black community. You were talking a little bit about adaptation and community memory. What I think we see happening now is that people are linking back into that contextualized community memory of the willpower of Black communities, of the power of linking with generations. And we see a shift happening, right this moment, we see this shift happening. And so in terms of context, when you think about the power of the philanthropic dollar, and because it wasn't just like, this wasn't just a consciousness of white philanthropists saying, you know what would be a great idea? Like, let's just give money to poor Black. That wasn't the crux of it. Even though it was a powerful progressive idea, there was a consciousness level that we're all in this together. And you can't have one whole facet of a population not being educated, not being economically empowered, because eventually you'll create the downfall for the entire community. We're in that exact same conversation now. And I think that we see a rise in trust philanthropy models that look at multi-year funding, that look at how do we support communities and development and trust them with our money in the way that Rosenwald schools did. And so they became these community hubs that served as a powerful place and a reminder that the community will was there before. It wasn't like they built the school and then people were like, oh, I should go to school now. People wanted education. People wanted access. People wanted community spaces. And I love the stories, the pictures that you showed with the quilters. I'm a quilter. My mother's a quilter. My grandmother was a quilter. So these ideas of like this community legacy that it's not necessarily like a spoken narrative. It's not necessarily like, I don't walk around with a quilt. I mean, you all see fabric behind me, but I don't walk around with quilts. And so sometimes these narratives around education and around the power of education and spaces in our community, they are not taken at the forefront. They're taken as superficial. But here we are looking at the connection. And for my work, and when I was traveling across the country doing some advocacy and organizing, what I saw was heartbreaking. And a lot of it is that it seems like the memories in the empowered communities and thinking about ourselves as a source of honor and dignity, and our education as a source of honor and dignity, a lot of that has been interspersed with larger superficial narratives, and it's hard to counteract that. And so we're in a space now, the work that I'm doing now is really thinking about how do we empower, particularly in the South, because the regional context is really important in this case. How do we empower parents and teachers? And most importantly, I think, is our young people as a part of this conversation so that we actually center their stories and let them inform how we go forward. Let them inform what their school experience looks like, because it's not going to look the same. Just like Rosenwald was a fundamental pivot, the Rosenwald schools were a fundamental pivot in how we even thought about education, how it should be dispersed and who should have access. We're in that same kind of moment right now.
Let me just add one small thing, if I can, James, to pick up what Janeen just said. My work is about using photography to bring people into these stories, people that have not yet known these stories and had access to these stories. And what Janeen's talking about, which I think is really powerful and really important, is the engagement of the community and this understanding that education is the path forward. Education has in fact been the backbone of the American dream since before there was the United States of America. The first taxpayer-funded school in America was created in 1644, and our commitment to public education goes back almost 400 years. But there is one of them, I want to talk about two photographs that illustrate exactly what Janeen's talking about. The Rosenwald Fund put out specifications for these schools. And they were modest, and they were modest for two reasons. One, they saved costs, but two, they did not want to attract the ire, otherwise known as arson, of the white community. And they specifically excluded cupolas. This is what I call the no doodads rule, because cupolas were seen as reflective of church architecture and violated a sense of separation of church and state. And in Eastern North Carolina, I showed this earlier, actually, this 3-teacher school, it's got a cupola. They gave these plans to the community, but that community had agency, and they built a cupola because they wanted a cupola. And in Pikeville, Tennessee, the Lincoln School, the walls inside the Lincoln School are covered with decorative pressed tin, and the ceilings are covered with this decorative pressed tin, because in that community, that was how they expressed their pride in their school. And so these are visual embodiments of what Janeen's just was talking about, that engagement of the entire community of the process of lifting up through education.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's just such a a visual. Because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about that visual of what brings pride to these communities and how they were invested in them. And there were two things that were said that I want to come back to with our panelists. This idea of act of resistance. Wow. I mean, that's a powerful statement in terms of thinking about the education of Blacks and African Americans in this country, that you would describe it that way. And then the pivot piece also, Raymond, was this idea of these partnerships, right? And so when I think about this work that we're talking about, but also the current context, what are your thoughts around this idea of the private-public partnership that took place back then, and how that potentially could look today in our schools? And then also how kind of the secondary question is, what does an act of resistance for these communities actually look like, or do you think should look like now? We saw what has been done, but I really want to make sure that we bring it to what's happening now, because there is this through line, and a lot of these conversations that we are having then we're still having now. So again, what are your thoughts on this public-private partnership piece? And then what does an act of resistance actually look like in these schools today?
Oh, James, the public-private partnership carries on today, although I would suggest with some unwelcomed elements for me, and I'll talk about that later. But at the same time, this resistance, and what does that look like? Back then, the resistance was, building the school and trying to stay under the radar because get your school burned down. I mean, these schools were burned down. Many of these books were intercepted at the railroads and burnt. Many of these books that the Jeans and the Slater Fund were paying for were destroyed. We know this, by folks who just did not want to see Black folks educated, just like, hundreds and if not thousands of mules that Black folks received were killed, because they didn't want to see Black folks, have a farm. Today, that resistance is more on the grassroots political side, I would say. The Southern Education Foundation, we work strong. I mean, that's in our DNA. It goes back to, the Janes and the Rosenwald days when we were getting schools organized through communities, with the first tax-supported education in the South. There was no tax-supported education in the South before the Civil War. What Andrew mentioned, that was the situation up north. But Horace Mann movement, Andrew, I think you're talking about, didn't make it. And there was a lot of resistance to that up north. People were saying, look, we'll pay taxes for roads and for bridges, but we're not going to pay taxes for somebody to get their child educated. If you want your child educated, hire yourself a teacher, or maybe send them to the church. And definitely they weren't going to do that in the South. And so when the war ended and, and all these funds were putting money to get Black folks educated, it was those communities that were coming together and getting legislation together for taxation to pay for schools, pay for public education. But directly to your question, that resistance today is in the form of grassroots educational organizations throughout the country, definitely throughout the South. We're working with them all the time, strengthening their understanding of policy and strengthening their understanding of how to advocate on behalf of primarily education resources and inequity in school funding. It's a big fight. School boards, the dismantling of school boards throughout the South should be a concern because you're deconstructing community empowerment. And which goes back to the public-private partnership. Yes, we have a lot of great public-private partnerships, some corporate, mostly philanthropic. Ford Foundations and Carnegie Foundations are still involved to some degree in supporting education improvement efforts throughout the country and definitely in the South. But you've got some who are, on the philanthropic side, who are pushing more, what would I say, dismantling efforts, vouchers, which, has this promise of saying, okay, you Black and brown folks can send your kids to a private school by taking, tax-supported vouchers and going over here. That's nothing new. Dr. King fought against that back in the 50s. That didn't come about until after Brown v. Board of Education. Bottom line, take the public money and fund private education. These private schools didn't even come into existence until after Brown v. Board of Education. And it was all about keeping the money second. This is nothing new. And so this public-private partnerships, we got to be careful because you got a lot of private interests, very well-funded private interests, who I believe are exploiting and preying upon the concerns and fears of good people who all they want is to get their child educated, and diverting and diluting public funds for public education. At the same time, we have to continue to strengthen that resistance that you talked about, James, by supporting, men and women of Black and brown and poor folks, who know the difference between right or wrong and know that their communities are not being resourced in an equitable fashion.
Absolutely. And, and in full disclosure to this panel, I am the head of school at a private institution, K-12 school. And what I oftentimes talk about is this idea that, if we can figure out how to make and get public education correct for all, in terms of this idea of equity, then schools like mine wouldn't have to exist, and they shouldn't exist in many ways. And so I am a big proponent of making sure that there's equity out there. And so, I really appreciate that comment because, from where I sit, I can and understand the privilege and the inequities that come with trying to educate Black and Brown kids in particular in this country. Janeen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that last question as well.
Yeah, I think a lot about acts of resistance in conjunction with education, because I think fundamentally, when people tell stories about those who were enslaved being caught with a book or being taught to read and how it was criminalized. And again, I think history has so much to teach us about what that just tells you about the power of our work, our words, and our literacy and how it can transform systems. And so when I think about acts of resistance, it's because those small things, those small acts, each letter you learn is creating a fundamental building block that counters the existing social order. We talk about this a little bit in the work of Creed. We have a report called Deep Rooted, and we talk about how racial inequity is actually embedded in the fabric of our policies, our legislature, and our practices. And so, and when we make that through line, when we're thinking about acts of resistance, when we talk, we get so celebratory when we hear of a teacher celebrating and honoring the cultural background of a student, in part because it's so little done, right? We get so excited when we hear about a student that has overcome challenges and struggle because the system is not built to cater to our students. And so for me, the acts of resistance piece particularly is important because it looks like, for one, it looks like we never actually experienced integration here. I don't know, like we haven't had that part of this conversation, like Rosenwald Schools were not around, but we are in an integrated public schools and we've never experienced integration. We don't know what integration looks like. It's actually, for us, it's a space of radical imagination to ask, like, what would it actually look like for us to actually integrate public schools? We don't know what it looks like in the US. We certainly don't know what it looks like in North Carolina, where I'm based. So to me, that's one act of resistance. Like, have we actually moved to integration? No, we have not. We've never experienced it before in the US. I think having an explicit racial equity lens. So when I hear Mr. Pierce talking about building up the grassroots coalition, absolutely, and absolutely, our students' voices should be at the center of that. But those students have to be empowered, and be empowered with a racial equity lens, because we, for so long in education spaces, have been taught not to talk about race or to have colorblind policy. None of that has worked. We are well than 25 more years into opportunity gap, or what is normally referred to as the achievement gap. We're 25 years into that, and we can't have a honest conversation about it without naming race explicitly. I think that the policy pushes and being informed about education policy, if we look across right now, what this looks like is this rabid debate about critical race theory, right? So we see this happening, and then we see massive legislation rolled out in like 8 states around critical race theory, and they know when you ask people to define it, they can't define it. They don't even know what it is. It's become a looming boogeyman. And so to me, like when we're having these conversations about acts of radical resistance, one is empowering our people, but particularly our young people, I can't say this enough, with knowledge of the policies that are impacting them day to day. I think in North Carolina, we have a major case called Leandro that has never been fully funded. It has never been fully funded. But when we talk about it now, no one, I don't hear the normal publics talking about this policy, and it directly impacts their child and how much funding allocation goes to each district, but we don't talk about it. And so I love the idea of the Rosenwald story being able to highlight the stories, the memories, the traditions, but to bring that through line to Andrew's point, when I see myself in the story, and I see myself in Rosenwald Schools, I see myself as an empowered community member, I see myself and my trajectory of my family who were touched by these stories. It's embedded in the history of our community to build these spaces that are holistic, that look at the whole person, the whole child, looks at our dignity, honors that, and then pushes forward with the educational agenda that thinks about transforming our systems. And for me, that is a radical resistance.
Wow.
If I may, I mean, because Janeen just touched upon a point, I feel compelled to respond, and I'm just so glad to hear what she's saying. And definitely her point in North Carolina. I was dean of the historically Black law school in North Carolina for 7 years, North Carolina Central, one of the two public law schools in that state. And as part of our public interest work, many of our students every year were involved with that Leandrew matter.
Yes.
And it is bad. I mean, I would say obscene. That has not, the political will to obstruct the implementation of what the courts have decided in that case. That's one. But here's a conundrum. Janeen, I got to push back a little bit, because I would say for at least 3 decades, this country experienced a large scale of integration. Following Brown v. Board of Education. A lot of resistance, but court-ordered busing, for whatever name you want to call it, did desegregate and integrate a lot of schools for a good 30, 35 years. But then you saw what happened around the 80s, definitely by the 90s, clearly by the 90s, those school districts have become resegregated. As whites fled, white flight, left these school districts, and a lot of Blacks who had money moved out to the suburbs. And so, in fact, Anna Nicole Jones, if you ever hear one of her presentations on that, she shows the charts where academic attainment levels for African Americans really went up during those decades of desegregation, integration. But I would query, because some folks would say, our schools are resegregated, and as some people in the civil rights world would say, a school that is predominantly Black is inherently inferior. Some people would take issue with that, and I would take issue with that, because that flies in the face of the community schools. That flies in the face.
So I think what you're saying is incredibly important, and I'd like to nuance what I'm saying a little bit. So for me, there is a distinct. I'm a product of attempted integration in schools. So for me, there is a distinction between segregation, desegregation, and integration. Yeah. And I would argue that we have never fully integrated, and we certainly haven't been able to measure longitudinally what the impact of full integration looks like, full and whole integration. Even here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which has been hailed as a model of integration, there obviously was court cases. You know better than I would as a lawyer. There were obviously major pushback for unifying the district and claiming that we had experienced full integration. And so my stance is, as a product of a public education system that was attempting to integrate. And I think we're in a moment right now where we see the pushback and the blowback from that. To your point, I think a lot of it has to do with proximity to whiteness. I think a lot of it has to do with attempting to replicate systems, and then we replicate harms in our community because of it. So in many ways, I'm agreeing with you, even though we have nuance around the language. I think we begin to desegregate our schools, and we were in the process of desegregating. I think we have never maintained integration.
Yeah, and and I would just add to that I think as I listen to both of you, one of the things that strikes me is that the desegregation of schools was a physical act. It was a very physical act. It was not, there were emotions that were tied to it, but the intellectual act of desegregation is a piece that, as I look at this work, that was really missed, because you can't just put people together without having the context of the why, and without teaching that piece of it. And so, my product in terms of growing up in the South, in a rural place where segregation, while de facto, if you will, in many ways, in terms of where people lived, and this idea of on the other side of the tracks and so forth. What I feel like we've missed a little bit was this idea that in bringing people together, you have to have the kinds of conversation and the language and the intentionality about why all this stuff is happening. And so the physical act, I think I can see how what that was supposed to do, but it's the mental, it's the emotional, it is the psychological components that at least as I look at the framework of where we are today, I find to be the missing component in terms of tying that physical act with us emotionally and intellectually so that we understood it and understand it. And I think that still, to me, strikes me as one of the reasons we're getting this pushback now, with critical race theory and with, anti-racism and all those kinds of things, is because the dialogue that is supposed to be attached to the physical nature of this work, I feel we've had a bit of a void from that perspective. Listen, I want to be, as the moderator, so I don't get myself in trouble, I want to be mindful of our time and in terms of where we are right now. And so I was looking to see if there were any questions from the audience out there, because we'd be glad to try to jump on a couple of those in our small time that we have left. So. All right. It's a quiet crowd out there. I don't know. Okay. There's a question out there, and it is the question is, how, for this panel, how do you feel, and what do you propose in terms of, for our current schools, how do they sew into the community, and how, I guess the question really is about, what does it look like in terms of the community really coming together to sew into that, if that makes sense. So maybe, let me see if I'm reading this correctly. Yeah, I'm not quite understanding the question, so let me try it again. Yeah, I'm not understanding the question, but we'll take one here. Actually, this is a great question. How do we donate to help restore the Rosenwald schools? Andrew, is there a space or place that people can donate to help out in this project?
Yeah, so there's a couple of answers to that question. Number one, a lot of the preservation efforts of Rosenwald Schools began back in 2002, when the National Trust for Historic Preservation designated Rosenwald Schools as one of the most endangered historic resources in the country. So today, under the auspices of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Brent Leggs leads a group called the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. They are dedicated to preserving sites of historic significance to African Americans. And so on a national level, you can get involved with the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. On the state level, each state has an equivalent or affiliate of the National Trust, and there's some local affiliates. So in Georgia, we have the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. We also have the Atlanta Preservation Center, Historic Savannah, Historic Columbus. So there's opportunities to get involved in those groups, and each of them may have some Rosenwald schools under their auspices. And the last thing is, there are individual initiatives that come together that are where the local community is trying to restore a specific school. And if folks will follow me on social media, when I'm aware of those, I do post about them. There's one, for example, in the Panhandle of Florida, of a Rosenwald school, where the community is just getting started raising funds to preserve that school. And I'm on, if you go to my website, which is andrewfeiler.com, you can find my social media tags under contact and follow me there.
Okay, excellent. There was a question that came in through the question and answer, and Paulus, I want you to be brief on this one. But the question is really interesting. It says, what can white people do to make sure that that the resources and the work that needs to be done in communities of color can happen? I know that's a big question, but it's an interesting one.
Vote. Vote. I mean, these matters come up as mills or almost every year. School board levies. Levies to raise money for schools. Under-resourced schools are constantly looking for funds, and so vote and support these requests, or get involved. Support your friends and neighbors for the school board, or get on the school board yourself, particularly school boards that represent even moderately diverse school districts. White people of good intent, please get on school boards and strengthen the governance of our public schools. The systems are in place. I think public education has been bombarded and disrupted for decades now. It's amazing the quality of education that we have now continue to go on, but we need good people involved, as opposed to the people who show up and want to oppose. All they want to do is oppose critical race theory. They really don't even know what critical race theory is even about.
Yeah. Janeen?
I would add to that, strengthen your racial equity lens before you go vote. Because I think like what happens is that people, they hear about a candidate, they hear something they're saying, and they're like, that sounds good. Please, please, please strengthen your racial equity lens. And by that, one of the simplest questions you can ask is who is harmed by that policy? And to keep digging and do some root cause analysis while you're doing it. Ask that question at least 5 times. Like, why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? And be in conversation with community members who are experiencing the harm. Because I think back to your point, James, around like the emotional, intellectual, and these social ideas, you have to be really intentional about addressing them. Because a lot of times, you know, it's not just enough to vote. You also have to sustain pressure on your candidate to basically to act right, because we are in years of generational trauma, and we have got to keep the pressure on. It's not enough to get them into the seat. We actually have to put pressure on them so that they are aligned with the values that got them there.
That's great. That's great. There are a number of other questions in the chat that we're not going to get to, and which tells me that you know, this, we may have to do this again, because I mean it was just fantastic in terms of hearing this and understanding this. And I want to close out just really quickly with the part of the afterword that was in the book by Brent Leggs that I just think is a wonderful piece to end on, because it just really spoke to me. And so I'm going to read this. And it says, I feel passionately that Black culture, landscape, and history matters, that our individual and collective identities matter. By learning from our shared past, not only do we celebrate the tremendous impact that people of color have made on our nation, its politics, society, culture, arts, ideals, but also we transmit that impact to the present. History shows us that countless ordinary citizens were the vanguards of collective action and human innovation. These schools put the student at the forefront of education for Southern African American children. The architecture of the schools was a tangible statement of the equality of all children. Their use made them a focal point of the community, identity, and aspirations. And when I hear that, and when I read that, there was a visceral reaction to this idea that the work that has been done, and we always talk about the standing on the shoulders of others, that we have been able to do that and capture that, and that it is us, all of those of us on this panel, and all of those who are out there listening. It is our responsibility to do our part to continue this critical work as we move into a new day and a new age. And so I thank you all panelists. I thank you, Andrew, for having the audacity to make this project a reality. And I give an incredible thanks to the National Center for allowing us an opportunity to have this amazing and very timely conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
I just wanted to thank everyone again as well, and just remind you all that the Andrew Feiler's exhibition is up tomorrow through December 12th. So you have a lot of time to come see it. So please come see it. And just thank you again to everyone who joined, and to our panelists and our moderator. It was a great discussion. And we definitely need to have more. So thank you all. And everyone have a great rest of your day and weekend.
Thank you. Good job.
Thanks, everybody.